Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the strangest, most feared, and paradoxically most sacred figures the Imperium of man has ever birthed. Not a Primarch, not a High Lord, not even an Inquisitor. No, the name that makes even the most zealous confessors pause mid-sermon is Ephrael Stern, a sister of battle whose existence defies death, dogma, and the very nature of imperial control. You don't get dubbed the Heretic Saint for nothing. The Imperium has always tried to simplify things. Good versus evil, faith versus heresy, light versus the warp. But Stern is a crack in that carefully built dichotomy. She is a living paradox, a loyal daughter of the Emperor who was cast out, hunted, and branded a heretic by the very system she once swore to uphold. And yet, she didn't fall. She didn't break. Instead, she became something else, something even more terrifying than a traitor. She became uncontrollable. Ephrael Stern isn't just feared because she survived what no one should have. It's not just about the powers she now wields or the things she's seen in the warp that would drive most mortals mad. No, what truly unnerves the Imperium is that she is a reminder that even the most rigid walls of imperial truth have cracks, that the divine can walk paths unblessed by terra, and that sanctity does not always require sanction. Imagine a world where miracles happen, but not the kind you can predict, categorize, or weaponize. That's Ephrael Stern. She doesn't serve a faction, a god, or even a coherent ideology anymore. She serves something else. Maybe it's fate, maybe it's the warp, maybe it's the Emperor in a form no one dares understand. And the scariest part? She keeps coming back. This is the story of the heretic saint they couldn't kill, the woman who walks through fire, betrayal, and demonic nightmares, not as a fallen soul, but as a symbol of something even more dangerous to the Imperium: free, unchained faith. If you really want to understand why the Imperium fears her, you'll have to follow the path she walked, one soaked in blood, light, and the unsettling feeling that the truth may be far more complicated than the ecclesiarchy ever admitted. Ephrael Stern's story doesn't begin with rebellion or miracle. It begins in duty, like so many others born into the ecclesiarchy's war machine. She wasn't a rogue psyker, or some child of prophecy whispered in the halls of Terra. She was a sister of battle, forged in faith, molded by fire, trained to kill in the name of the Emperor without hesitation or doubt. A warrior molded by the Order's militant, specifically the Order of Our Martyred Lady, known for their unshakable devotion and brutal efficiency. That's what makes her fall, or perhaps her rise, so unsettling. She came from a place of absolute loyalty. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about Stern in the early years. She trained hard, prayed harder, and stood shoulder to shoulder with her sisters, cloaked in the iconography of martyrdom and righteous fury. Yet even then, some whispered that there was something different about her. Not wrong, exactly, but something you couldn't quite name. She had a stillness, a sense of calm beneath the religious fervor, like she wasn't entirely anchored in the same plane of emotion as the others. Some thought she was simply more pious than most, a rare clarity of purpose. Others, less charitably, said she lacked the burning soul expected of the Order. Everything changed at the fortress of Sanctalis. The mission was standard, a garrison duty on a seemingly insignificant world, the kind of post meant to maintain a symbolic presence more than wage any real war. No one expected the outbreak of horror that followed. It was supposed to be quiet. It was anything but. The fortress became a charnel house almost overnight. The enemy, if you could call it that, was something few understood. A warp incursion, sudden and violent, like a scream from the Imperium that shattered the silence of the stars. Demonic entities surged through the veil, overwhelming the sisters with unholy speed. Communications failed. Reinforcements never arrived. It was a massacre. But Ephrael Stern didn't die. She was found alone, surrounded by corpses, both her sisters and the demons that had butchered them. No wounds, no blood on her body, just her, in the center of a massacre, eyes calm, voice silent. The official accounts tried to explain it away. Divine intervention, perhaps. The Emperor's will. A miracle. But those who saw her, who truly looked into her eyes, said there was no joy in her survival. No elation. Just something, haunted, detached. That moment at Sanctalis was the first fracture in the facade. From there, suspicion grew. Why had she survived? What force had protected her, or worse, empowered her? Was she blessed or cursed? For the sisters, whose lives revolve around sacrifice, dying in battle is the ultimate expression of faith. Stern's survival was not seen as glory, it was seen as an aberration. Her sisters began to treat her differently. There were no accusations, no formal charges, not yet, but the distance grew. Eyes that once saw a comrade now flickered with unease. She was reassigned, interrogated, evaluated by confessors and psychers alike. Every report came back inconclusive. She wasn't possessed. She wasn't psychically active. She was simply Ephrael. And that terrified them. Many fans, including myself, have debated whether Sanctalis was a test, not of faith, but of fate. What if Stern wasn't meant to survive by chance, but by design? What if the warp didn't touch her that day, but noticed her, marked her in some ineffable way? There's a theory that she didn't resist the warp so much as it passed through her, like a wind bending around stone, that she became a void in its current, invisible, intangible, but deeply unnatural. And then there's the question of the demons. Why were they dead? She never spoke of how she killed them. No weapon was found in her hand, no battle damage on her armor. Some say they tore each other apart in confusion. Others whisper that they simply stopped existing. Like they had entered a space that denied their essence, a soul immune to corruption or temptation. If that's true, if Stern is some kind of null zone, not by technology but by nature, then her existence isn't just unusual, it's blasphemous. Because the ecclesiarchy doesn't do well with anomalies. It thrives on certainty, hierarchy, and control. And Ephrael Stern, even in this early stage, represented a crack in that control. She was a sister who survived the impossible and couldn't explain why. A soldier who followed every rite, every prayer, yet still stood apart. And the worst part? She never asked to. She didn't rebel or question orders. She just was. To me, and many who follow her fragmented tale, this is where her tragedy begins. Not in exile, not in power, but in the subtle moment her faith began to isolate her instead of connect her. She was too faithful to be deemed a heretic, yet too changed to be trusted. And in the grim calculus of the Imperium, that makes you dangerous. So when people ask why the Imperium fears her, this is where it starts. Not with power, not with heresy, but with the fear of something that cannot be labeled, contained, or punished. Sanctalis wasn't just a massacre, it was an awakening. Not just for Stern, but for the Imperium. An unspoken realization that one of their own no longer fit the mold. And that was enough to plant the seeds of fear. What happened after Sanctalis wasn't some glorious resurrection arc. It was quieter, stranger, like watching someone fall upward. Ephrael Stern didn't return to accolades or open arms. She returned to suspicion, murmurs, the creeping discomfort that clung to her like shadow. The Order had no precedent for someone like her. Sisters don't survive daemon incursions alone. They die in faith, or they're corrupted. But Stern was neither, and that created a vacuum the ecclesiarchy couldn't tolerate. So they filled it the only way they knew how. With fear. Reports filtered back slowly, stitched together from fragmented augur records and scattered witness testimonies. A single survivor. A psychic spike. Unnatural atmospheric shifts. All sensors and vox recordings from the Sancta region scrambled beyond use. One inquisitorial scribe even noted that certain liturgical icons at the site had begun to rust and blacken, though none could explain how. It was as if reality itself had hiccuped in her presence. Of course, officially all of this was redacted or dismissed. But word spreads, especially among those who know what to listen for. She was placed in isolation almost immediately. Officially, it was for recuperation and debriefing. Unofficially, it was containment. No visitors. No contact, just constant monitoring by both sisters and Inquisition agents. One of the more chilling rumors claims she spent weeks reciting scripture flawlessly, without sleep or pause, as if something else were keeping her awake. Others say she drew symbols on the walls, not in blood, but in burnt ash that would reappear even after scrubbing. And still, there was no evidence of taint. That was the worst part for those watching. If they had found warp corruption, they could have acted swiftly, cleanly. But there was nothing. Her blood was pure, her aura unreadable. Even the sanctioned psychers couldn't get a clear impression of her soul. It was like trying to read a page that had been soaked in oil. One inquisitor described it not as a presence, but an absence. Something missing from her humanity, or maybe something added that didn't belong. But again, nothing conclusive, only shadows. The term heretic saint hadn't yet been spoken aloud, but it was already forming in the corners of people's thoughts. A living paradox, one the ecclesiarchy couldn't denounce without undermining its own mythology. After all, miracles were real, weren't they? Saints were real. The emperor worked in mysterious ways, but he was supposed to work through approved channels, through glorious martyrs and loyal servants. Stern didn't fit. She had no visions. She gave no sermons. She didn't glow with divine light. She just endured. What really started to unnerve people, what truly planted the seed of fear, was her silence. She didn't protest her treatment. She didn't plead innocence. She simply existed, detached, watching, processing, not with the zeal of a sister of battle, but with something colder, calculating, like she was beginning to see the world differently. And maybe she was. There are theories among fans, wild ones sure, but compelling, that Stern didn't survive Sanctalis untouched, but that her soul was altered in some fundamental way. Not possessed, not corrupted, but rewritten, like a machine's spirit reprogrammed mid-function. Some think the warp didn't want her. That's the wildest bit, that it rejected her, that whatever forces surged through that battlefield tried to claim her, and failed, and in doing so left something broken or remade, a kind of living anti-demon. But if that's true, if Stern became some sort of spiritual anomaly, then what does that mean for the rest of the Imperium? Faith is not supposed to be a question in this universe. It is supposed to be a law. And she, just by existing, turned that law into a question mark. Eventually, of course, the Inquisition had to act. They couldn't hold her forever, not without charges, so they released her back to her order, under observation. That should have been the end of it. A footnote in the archives, but of course it wasn't, because wherever Stern went, things started to unravel. Small things at first, faint warp echoes in her presence, shadows that lingered too long, servitors stalling mid-function. Once a picked capture of her prayer session shorted out in a cascade of static that resembled screaming. All of this could be dismissed. Equipment malfunctions, atmospheric interference, coincidence, but taken together, a pattern. Her fellow sisters tried to treat her normally, but it never stuck. The camaraderie was gone. She was no longer a peer. She had become a ghost walking in a temple full of the living. Her presence cast long psychological shadows, and worse, it made others start to doubt. If she was truly a miracle, why was she being hidden? Why were the sermons silent on her survival? And then came the dreams. This is one of the more obscure parts of the lore, whispered in fan circles. Some believe that after Stern returned, certain sisters started experiencing visions. Not from the Emperor. From her, or because of her. Not words, but impressions. Cold stars, empty cities, eyes that never closed. One chronicler described it as faith inverted, not heresy, not corruption, just stillness. Not peace, just the absence of war, the absence of purpose. And if that's what Stern became, a mirror held up to the Imperium, one that reflected not its glory but its fragility, then no wonder they began to fear her. Because she didn't scream rebellion. She whispered dissonance. Surviving the massacre wasn't just a physical act, it was metaphysical. Something cracked open at Sanctalis, and Ephrael Stern walked out through the breach. Not because she was strong, or lucky, or faithful, but because the universe wasn't ready to claim her yet. And maybe never will be. That's what haunts me. That's what haunts everyone who really thinks about her. She's not a threat you can fight, or silence, or burn. She's a question that doesn't stop asking itself. And in the Imperium, that's more dangerous than any demon. Something happened to Ephrael Stern in the warp. Not during the aftermath, not in the long silence that followed the massacre at Sanctalis. No, something inside the warp noticed her, reached out, and didn't let go. It's hard to say where exactly the transformation began, because the change wasn't sudden. It crept in, quiet, insidious, like the echo of a scream you didn't hear until your bones remembered it. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Because Ephrael didn't become possessed, she became other. There were no obvious signs at first. No glowing eyes, no speaking in tongues, no violent outbursts. In fact, many of the early observers noted how calm she was. Too calm. Detached in a way that felt unnatural. She spoke when spoken to, prayed when expected, followed orders with precision. But there was no passion in it, no flame, like she was imitating what she used to be, not truly living it. The first real signs of warp influence didn't come from her actions, they came from the world around her. Machines malfunctioned in her presence as if the Omnissiah himself held his breath. Servoskulls drifted off course. Auspex readings fluctuated. Once, a senior canoness reportedly collapsed mid-litany with a vision of a black ocean beneath a burning sky, claiming she saw Stern standing at its center, untouched. The ecclesiarchy tried to silence that report, but it had already spread. Whispers began. Ephrael was cursed, or worse, chosen. And then the dreams started again. But this time, they weren't confined to those near her. Stern herself began to speak of visions, not dreams, not nightmares, but revelations. She described cities of glass and bone, battles fought in moments that spanned centuries, stars screaming as they died. She spoke of something she called the song that was never sung, a sound that echoed before the warp had a name. She should have been executed on the spot, but she wasn't, because even in their fear, they couldn't be sure she was lying. There was no madness in her eyes, just certainty. This is where things get really strange. Stern began to display abilities, not sanctioned psyker powers. There were no lightning bolts, no mind control, nothing that could be cataloged in a lexicanum. It was more like the warp moved around her, bent to her without her asking. There's a report from a skirmish where she walked through a group of daemons completely untouched, and they simply unraveled. Not torn apart, not banished, just ceased, vanished. And Ephrael didn't even raise her voice. It was around this time that inquisitors began to theorize that she might not be a psyker at all, but something far more rare, a warp anomaly. A living contradiction in the psychic fabric of reality. One inquisitor called her a living blind spot, something the warp couldn't see or touch without distorting. That same inquisitor was later found dead, heart stopped, eyes burned black, lips frozen mid-word. No sign of attack, just ended. Some fans believe that Stern isn't channeling the warp, but is the result of its backlash, like a bullet that ricocheted inside the Imperium and came out the other side shaped like a human. Others think she's becoming a new kind of psyker. Not bound by the known disciplines, not even human in the conventional sense anymore. A proto-being. A soul that walked through the storm and came back changed, not corrupted, but rewritten at the quantum level. The Ordo Malleus tried to label her a potential daemon host, but again the tests failed. No signs of possession, no presence within her except her own. And this is what really rattles the dogmatic core of the Imperium. She doesn't fit. She breaks every category. You can't burn a witch if the flames won't catch. You can't exorcise someone who isn't haunted. And you can't deny a miracle when it stares at you and asks nothing. Eventually, she stopped explaining herself. The visions continued, but she no longer shared them unless asked. And even then, her words became more abstract. I saw the warp forget itself, she once said, like a god blinking. Another time, she whispered that the Emperor wasn't watching anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of what she was becoming. And maybe that's the truth that terrifies the Imperium. Not that Stern has gone mad or that she's been corrupted, but that she's becoming something new, something uncontainable, not a traitor, not a servant of chaos, but a variable, a spiritual wildcard. If you look at the deeper records, the ones buried in redacted archives and half-erased kill orders, you'll find patterns. Battles where Stern was present that ended in improbable victories. Places where demons collapsed in on themselves. Soldiers who followed her without understanding why. This isn't loyalty. It's gravity. Stern doesn't lead. She pulls. To me, the most terrifying thing isn't that she might be a weapon. It's that she might be a message. A sign that the warp itself is evolving, shifting, reacting to the failures of both chaos and the Imperium. And Stern is the first whisper of that change. Not a saint, not a heretic, but a signal. This is the part where many of us start to believe she's no longer fully human. That what survived Sanctalis wasn't just Ephrael Stern. It was a being standing on the knife edge between materium and immaterium. Something that learned how to exist in both and belong to neither. And what do you do with something like that? You can't pray to it. You can't kill it. All you can do is fear it. There's a certain bitter irony in realizing that Ephrael Stern wasn't hunted first by daemons or xenos or heretic warlords, but by her own. The Imperium, this vast machine of faith and fire, issued the order to destroy her. A kill warrant, justified not by proof of guilt, but by fear of possibility. And that, more than anything else, speaks to the heart of how rigid, how utterly terrified the Imperium truly is of what it cannot categorize. You have to understand the kind of system Stern was born into. The Imperium doesn't tolerate ambiguity. It survives, barely, by maintaining a brutal binary: loyal or heretic, clean or corrupted, alive or purged. There is no room for the in-between. And Stern, after Sanctalis, after her visions and warp touch and impossible survival, she was the in-between. A walking question mark in a universe that has no patience for questions. The trigger came in the form of a report. An inquisitorial conclave, citing escalating anomalies surrounding Stern's presence, officially declared her soul unstable and contaminated. They didn't call her a demon host. They couldn't, but they called her touched, and that was enough. With a flick of a quill and a prayer to the throne, her name was added to the kill rolls. Not just a target, a priority. I've always found it haunting and frankly telling that the first formal hunt for Stern wasn't led by chaos cults or alien bounty hunters, but by a detachment of her own sisters of battle. The order she once bled for, now hunting her like a rabid beast. The documents refer to it as a cleansing operation, but the records don't lie. It was an execution squad. Nothing ceremonial, nothing righteous, just cold surgical elimination. And here's the kicker. She didn't even resist at first. According to recovered logs, when the squad approached her on the outskirts of Raxos Prime, Stern greeted them in silence, lowered her weapons, and waited. They hesitated. One sister, Canoness Relia, reportedly wept behind her mask. Then, before they could fire, everything around them broke. Not exploded, not melted. Broke, as if reality fractured and simply refused to let the act happen. Of the team sent after her, only 2 survived. One went mad. The other refused to speak at all, later dying during interrogation by the Ordo Hereticus. From that moment on, Ephrael Stern wasn't a soldier, she was a fugitive. What I find most tragic and most infuriating is that she never turned her back on the Emperor, never. Not once. She still bore his symbol, still recited litanies, still whispered his name before every act of violence. But that didn't matter. Faith, in the eyes of the Imperium, only counts if it's controlled. The moment it becomes personal, unregulated, it becomes dangerous. And Stern's faith, it had become pure. Not in the sense of sanctioned, approved doctrine, but in the sense that it was hers. She didn't need the ecclesiarchy anymore. She didn't need rosaries or relics or sermons. She believed. And that, paradoxically, is what damned her. There's a theory I've always loved, one that says the ecclesiarchy didn't fear Stern because she might fall to chaos, but because she might become a saint, not their saint. Not a carefully curated icon of martyrdom they could parade on shrine worlds, but a true, unfiltered, miracle-working saint. One they couldn't control, canonize, or silence. Because think about it, if Stern started gathering followers, if people began to see what she was and believe, what happens to the power structure? What happens to the dogma? The moment faith becomes personal instead of institutional, the ecclesiarchy loses its grip. That's why the Inquisition got involved so aggressively. Not just the Ordo Hereticus, but elements of the Ordo Malleus too. Psychers, nulls, even kill teams pulled from Deathwatch assets. Entire cells were redirected just to monitor her movements, intercept her allies, erase her trail. And yet she always stayed one step ahead. Not through cunning or espionage, but because somehow she was always warned. Some believe it was precognition. Others think the warp itself, for reasons no one understands, was guiding her path. There's a chilling report where an entire Inquisition facility on the moon of Kale's Hollow spontaneously lost all power for 17 minutes, during which time Ephrael walked in, retrieved a data core, and left, unseen. No alarms, no bloodshed, just silence. That's not chaos. That's not heresy. That's something else. And still they chased her, like a hound chasing smoke. Every time she appeared, things unraveled. Not because she brought destruction, but because her presence made people question. Soldiers hesitated. Confessors stammered. Civilians began to whisper stories of the heretic saint, not in fear, but in hope. And that, more than anything, sealed her fate. The Imperium cannot tolerate hope unless it is sanctioned. It cannot abide miracles unless they serve the bureaucracy. and it cannot allow a woman who defies death, commands silence, and preaches without words to walk freely, even if she still whispers the Emperor's name, especially if she does. So they gave the order, again and again, rewritten, reissued, red-stamped and laced with litanies. Her image burned into the minds of assassins, purity sealers, and orbital bombardment officers alike. But she kept walking, not to lead, not to preach, just forward. And that is what terrifies them the most. Because she isn't fighting for power or glory or rebellion. She isn't even fighting to survive. She walks because she must. Because something in the warp, or maybe something far older, is pulling her toward a truth the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to bury. And the only thing they know to do in the face of that truth is kill it. The Inquisition isn't known for its patience. It's an institution built on absolutes: purge or protect, condemn or classify. And yet, when it came to Ephrael Stern, the Ordo Malleus found itself paralyzed by something it almost never experiences: uncertainty. This wasn't some rogue psyker conjuring warp lightning in a hive spire. This was a sister of battle, trained and tested, forged in the faith of the Emperor, and yet undeniably wrong in ways they couldn't explain. From the outside, it looked like a textbook case of possession, surviving a demonic incursion, displaying strange effects on her environment, speaking in cryptic phrases, and exhibiting a kind of emotional disassociation. Any one of those would have been enough for summary execution. But something about Stern made the Inquisition hesitate. Perhaps it was her unshakable composure, the lack of typical signs of warp taint, or maybe it was pride. That nagging instinct that if she truly was a new kind of threat, then killing her without understanding her first would be a dangerous waste of knowledge. The Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters, were the first to take her seriously. She wasn't just a curiosity anymore. She was a potential vector, or worse, a vessel. In their internal reports, she was referred to as Subject Anathema Variant, and later, Entity Stern. Even that change in language says everything. She stopped being a human in their eyes and became a phenomenon, not a person, but an event. And yet they couldn't agree on what kind of event. Some inquisitors, especially the older, more fanatical ones, were convinced she was host to a particularly subtle daemon. They cited her silence, her uncanny survivability, and her apparent warp resistance as evidence that something ancient and manipulative was lurking inside her, masking its presence. These inquisitors pushed for immediate termination, not just of Stern, but of anyone who had prolonged contact with her. But not all agreed. And this is where it gets really interesting. A faction within the Inquisition began to push back. These were not soft-hearted idealists. They were inquisitors who had spent their lives studying the warp, and they knew how corruption behaves. Stern didn't fit. She didn't slip into madness. She didn't bend reality to her will. She bent away from it. Her presence was disruptive, but not chaotic. Some began to theorize that she might be a null, or some hybridized evolution of a blank, a psychic anomaly immune to demonic infection. One radical even went so far as to suggest she might be a weapon crafted by the warp against chaos itself. A living contradiction, a blade so paradoxical that even the great powers couldn't hold her. It was around this time that the internal war over Stern began. Not on the battlefield, but within the Inquisition itself. Two inquisitors in particular became symbolic of the split: Inquisitor Silas Ankar, who saw Stern as a growing cancer, and Inquisitor Acria Vale, who believed Stern might be the key to understanding a whole new facet of the warp. Ankar launched kill teams. Vale sabotaged them. Ankar demanded exterminatus clearance on suspected sighting locations. Vale redacted them. Some fans call this the inquisitorial schism of Stern, and it's honestly one of the most fascinating, unspoken conflicts in the lore. Because for once, the Inquisition's enemy wasn't a daemon prince or heretical cult. It was doubt. Doubt in their own process. Doubt in their own judgment. And while they argued, Stern walked free. The Ordo Hereticus got involved too, but their approach was almost theatrical. Public denunciations, shrine world edicts, stern-faced preachers warning the faithful to avoid the whispering saint. They treated her more like a contagious myth than a military threat. Meanwhile, the Ordo Malleus kept trying to corner her in the shadows. One documented incident from the archives still gives me chills. On the dead moon of Juno 9, a Deathwatch strike force was deployed under Malleus' command to intercept Stern. They never made contact. The entire unit vanished. The only remnant was a single Vox recording, white noise layered over what analysts described as a child's voice humming a battle hymn in reverse. Stern was seen days later, walking barefoot across the surface of the moon, leaving no prints in the ash. That's the kind of presence she had. Not explosive, not theatrical, just wrong. A void of certainty. What really tore the Ordo apart, though, was that Stern seemed completely uninterested in power. She wasn't building a cult. She didn't spread doctrine. She wasn't corrupting others. She avoided people, avoided conflict, unless forced into it. And even then, her kills were surgical. Efficient, never excessive. One inquisitor wrote that watching Stern fight was like witnessing inevitability. The way gravity does not rage, it just is. I think that says everything about why they couldn't stop her. She wasn't acting with malice or pride. She was moving according to a will that even she didn't fully understand. And the warp? It didn't seem to resist her, nor did it embrace her. That terrified both sides of the Inquisition, because the warp always reacts. Always. To everything. But Stern, it was like the warp paused around her. Some kind of metaphysical hesitation, like reality itself was holding its breath when she walked by. There are theories, of course, countless theories, that she's a fragment of the Emperor's soul, that she's what happens when a psyker is purified through faith alone, that she's a mistake the warp regrets making. I don't know which I believe, but I know this. When the Inquisition fears each other more than their target, something has gone deeply, terribly wrong. And Ephrael Stern didn't ask for any of this. That's the part people forget. She didn't summon demons. She didn't betray her order. She just lived, survived, changed. And now she walks with a shadow that even the Inquisition can't pin down. And that, more than anything, is why they hunt her. Not because she's a monster, but because she might be something new, something the Imperium can't explain, and therefore must destroy. At some point, even the most hunted soul finds someone who doesn't immediately raise a gun. For Ephrael Stern, that person was Kaiganil of the Bloody Tears, or as most refer to him in more formal records, Kaiganil Belisarius, a name wrapped in mystery like so many elements of her story. He was an imperial, not in the sanctioned sense, not a soldier, not an inquisitor, and certainly not a servant of the ecclesiarchy. He was something far older, far stranger, an outcast harlequin, a member of the Eldar, yes, but not like the others. Even among Xenos, Kaiganil was a deviation. And still, he chose her. It's honestly one of the strangest dynamics in Warhammer lore, a being from a race that sees humans as little more than doomed, short-lived echoes of a failed galaxy, and yet Kaiganil becomes Stern's most trusted companion. He wasn't sent, he wasn't summoned, he appeared. And the timing, of course, is impossible to ignore. Kaiganil finds her during a moment of collapse, a point where Ephrael is not just being hunted, but is near spiritual exhaustion. Not just the threat of death, but the weight of why she keeps surviving. The constant questioning of whether her life is truly hers, or whether she's become a puppet of something far beyond comprehension. And into that existential storm steps Kaiganil. No fear, no judgment, just recognition. What's fascinating is that Kaiganil doesn't worship the Emperor, doesn't even acknowledge him in the way humans do. And yet, he treats Stern as something sacred, not because of her faith, but because of her function. In the eyes of the Harlequins, all things play a role in the cosmic performance of fate, and Stern, in Kaiganil's view, had become something unprecedented. A human caught between masks, neither demon nor saint, neither loyalist nor rebel, just change. Their partnership is strange and unsettling. There's no romantic angle. That would be ridiculous, even tone-deaf given everything, but there is a closeness, a tension that comes not from affection but from necessity. They are two anomalies, navigating a universe that has no room for anomalies, and over time, that necessity becomes trust. Their escape from Imperial forces on the tomb world of Nemiros is a perfect example of that trust. Hunted by Ordo Hereticus agents and surrounded by a collapsing reality field, it's Kaiganil who risks himself to carve a path through time-warped corridors and impossible terrain. Not because he believes in Stern's cause, but because he believes in possibility. And that's where their views begin to diverge. Stern is still clinging to something. Some vestige of human faith, some idea that the Emperor's light might still be real, even if his church is rotten. But Kygonel has no such illusions. To him, the galaxy is a dying play, a tragedy hurtling toward its final act. His interest in Stern isn't salvific, it's narrative. He sees her as a wild card that might shift the ending. Maybe not for the better, maybe not for the worse, just different. There are moments between them, not many, but documented in the cryptic tales that follow them, where they argue, not loudly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Stern speaks of choice. Kygonel speaks of inevitability. She still prays in her own way. He dances through ruins and laughs at gods. And yet, they stay together. To me, this is one of the most compelling elements of Stern's story, that the only being who truly accepts her isn't human at all, not even remotely. But perhaps that's why it works. Because Kygonel doesn't carry the baggage of human dogma. He doesn't fear the warp in the same way. He sees her for what she is, not what she's supposed to be. And in turn, she doesn't ask him to change. That mutual understanding, two beings traveling through a galaxy that wants them erased, becomes the foundation of something rare in Warhammer. Companionship without control. Trust without expectation. Some fans theorize that Kygonel is guiding her toward something, that the harlequins, through him, are manipulating a new future using Stern as a chess piece. Maybe. The Eldar have always played the long game. But I think it's deeper than that. I think Kygonel believes in her, not as a savior, not as a prophet, but as a chance that the cycle of annihilation might not end the way everyone expects. There's one account, vague, half-rumored, where Kygonel is said to have stood between Stern and an inquisitorial executioner and simply said, "Not this time." And it worked. The inquisitor lowered their weapon and walked away. Was it trickery? Psychic suggestion? Or just the unbearable truth that sometimes the universe throws you a scene you're not prepared to act in? Their path is still ongoing. We don't know where it leads. But what we do know is this. Without Kygonel, Stern likely wouldn't have survived as long as she has. Not because he saves her, but because he reminds her that there's still more to see, more to be. And that, for someone who's been cast out, hunted, and branded a paradox, is more powerful than any bullet or blade. And so they walk. A heretic saint and a trickster warrior. A woman of broken faith and a being of ancient performance, not as messiah and disciple, but as two fragments of something larger, undefined. And if that doesn't scare the Imperium, it should. There's a moment in Ephrael Stern's story that shifts everything. Not a battle, not a betrayal, but a whisper, a voice. Quiet at first, like the hum of blood in your ears, then louder, more insistent. It doesn't roar, it doesn't scream in demonic tongues, it asks, it tells, it knows. And that voice, that presence that began to echo through Stern's thoughts, is called Malefic. Not a Malefica, not the Malefica, just Malefic. Plural and singular at once, like the concept itself was too large, too old to wear a number. The first question everyone asks is obvious. Is it a daemon? The Inquisition thinks so. The Ecclesiarchy preaches it. Even some among the Ordo Malleus are certain it's a dark patron, some nameless warp entity that took root in Stern when Sanctalis collapsed around her. And I get it. I really do. That's the safe answer. The Imperium needs her to be possessed. Because if she isn't, then what is she? But here's the thing. Malefic doesn't behave like a daemon. It doesn't demand sacrifice. It doesn't offer power in exchange for service. It doesn't corrupt, seduce, or infect. It doesn't even ask for anything. It just speaks, warns, reminds. Sometimes cryptic, sometimes horrifying, but always there. A presence in Stern's mind that doesn't replace her thoughts, it sits alongside them. Like a second consciousness, a shadow voice. Not a master, not a parasite, a mirror. There's a passage in one of the hidden logs buried in an Ordo Hereticus vault where a captured transcript of Stern's interrogation records her saying this. It does not speak through me, it speaks to me. It tells me what the stars forgot. It tells me what the galaxy used to know, before we sealed ourselves in silence. The interrogator naturally deemed her insane, but I don't think she was. I think she was being honest. Some fans theorize that Malefic is not one being, but a fragment of something greater, a psychic echo from before the birth of chaos itself, a collective memory of the warp trying to reassert itself through the only conduit that survived its gaze. And Stern, broken but uncorrupted, became the only vessel quiet enough to hear it. Others think Malefic might be the emperor, or at least a splinter of his will, not the shining god that the ecclesiarchy worships, but the raw, impossible psychic force he once was. The emperor, after all, was never fully human. What if some aspect of him remained in the warp, unspoken, unacknowledged, and it found Stern, or perhaps she found it? That's the version that keeps me up at night. Because if that's true, then the greatest secret of the Imperium might not be chaos. It might be that its own god no longer speaks through its institutions, but through a hunted woman walking the stars. There's also another darker theory, that Malefic isn't benevolent, that it's something entirely outside the known pantheon of the warp. Not chaos undivided, not one of the four, not a minor godling or forgotten entity, but something new. A consciousness born in the fractures of reality, not shaped by emotion, but by paradox. A being that cannot be named because naming it would give it shape, and shape would mean limits. And maybe that's why the Imperium fears it so much. Because it's not evil in the way they understand. It doesn't tempt or threaten. It simply is. A voice with no agenda, and that's terrifying. Because if you can't identify the enemy, you can't fight it. If you can't classify a presence, you can't exorcise it. And if you can't banish the voice, but it still tells you truths that unravel doctrine, what do? There's a chilling scene, referenced only in fragments, where Stern is surrounded by Adepta Sororitas, weapons drawn, chanting purging litanies. She says nothing. But when one of them challenges her, demands she denounce the thing inside her, she simply answers, it never asked to be worshipped, only heard. The sisters falter. Some lower their weapons, one begins to cry. Because that's what Malefic does. It doesn't scream heresy, it whispers doubt. And in a galaxy where doubt is punishable by death, that's worse than treason. Because Malefic doesn't seek converts. It doesn't want an army. It just exists. And through Stern it sees. There's evidence, again, suppressed, scattered, that places where Stern travels sometimes exhibit strange effects. Not warp storms, not demonic activity, but clarity. Soldiers who disobey orders that would kill civilians. Confessors who pause mid-sermon and question a line. A silence that falls over cathedrals, not out of reverence but recognition. It's as if Malefic doesn't infect, it awakens. And that, more than anything, is the true threat to the Imperium. Because the Imperium isn't built on truth, it's built on control. On the idea that humanity must be shielded from the truth at all costs, that ignorance is not just bliss but salvation. And Malefic? Malefic is a crack in that wall. What if it's not a daemon, but a memory of the galaxy before fear? What if it's not evil, but honesty? What if it speaks not to deceive, but to remind us of what we gave up for safety? Some fans think that's the real enemy of the Imperium. Not Xenos, not traitors, not even the ruinous powers. But memory. The idea that something greater once was, and might be again. And that Stern, unwilling and unready, became the vessel for that truth. So when the ecclesiarchy calls her a heretic, when inquisitors mark her for death, when the Adeptus Mechanicus burns her image from data slates, they're not reacting to a monster. They're reacting to the voice behind her eyes, a voice that doesn't scream, a voice that doesn't beg, a voice that simply remembers. Somewhere along the bloodied, flame-lit corridors of her exile, Ephrael Stern stopped being merely a fugitive. She became something else, something far more dangerous to the Imperium than any traitor legion or apostate cardinal. She became an idea. Not the kind etched into marble on shrine worlds, but the kind whispered in the dark by those who still dare to hope. The heretic saint, the martyr without a tomb. A symbol for those whose faith doesn't quite fit the molds the ecclesiarchy forged. She never asked for it. That's what makes it so powerful. Stern didn't build a cult. She didn't carve her likeness into cathedral walls or command pilgrims to kneel. Her image spread the way wildfire does, uncontrolled, unpredictable, and impossible to stop once it found kindling. People who had nothing, who had lost families to the endless wars, who had watched the faith turn cold and bureaucratic, they started to see her not as a warning, but as a sign. Proof that maybe, just maybe, the Emperor's will wasn't entirely monopolized by the High Lords and their relic-fattened priests. And she didn't stop them. That's what rattled the system even more. Because instead of denying it, Stern walked with it. She let the myth grow around her. Let the name Heretic Saint follow her like a shadow, not to embrace it, but because denying it would have meant playing by the same rules that exiled her. And the truth is, her powers, if we can even call them that, only made the image harder to kill. There's no real classification for what she can do now. It's not sorcery, it's not psychic in the conventional sense. But there are documented accounts, more than whispers, of her surviving mortal wounds, not by armor or augmetics, but by refusal. Like death itself, paused, uncertain. A bullet that should have split her skull slowed midair. Fire that should have engulfed her flickered and veered away. Once, she stood on the surface of a world during atmospheric collapse and simply kept walking. No suit, no shield, no explanation. Some say she can see moments before they happen. Not quite precognition, but an instinct sharpened to something unnatural. Others claim she can silence warp entities with a look. Not banishment, not exorcism, just negation. As if they cease to exist because she wills it. Not from anger, not from power, from truth. And that might be the most terrifying part. That her faith, broken and reformed as it is, still works. Because this isn't sanctioned belief. She doesn't chant the litany of benediction. She doesn't wear relics or seek the blessing of confessor priests. Her faith is raw, personal, true. And in a universe where manufactured piety is the norm, that's the most dangerous kind of belief. On several worlds, usually poor, usually forgotten by Terra, her name appears on walls. Just the word stern, sometimes scrawled in blood, sometimes in ash, and always below it, the phrase, "She walks, we follow." No formal doctrine, no creed, just the idea that someone, somewhere, still believes without permission. And yet, even with all this weight on her shoulders, Stern never calls herself a prophet. Never preaches, never offers salvation. That's what makes her feel real. She bleeds, she doubts, she still whispers prayers in the old tongue, even when no one is listening. Her strength isn't that she became more than human, it's that she never stopped trying to be one. In a way, that might be her greatest miracle. What's wild is how different factions react to her myth. The ecclesiarchy foams with rage, of course. Their response has ranged from excommunication to outright orbital bombardment of suspected cult gatherings. The Inquisition is torn. Some see her as a threat that must be neutralized, others as a specimen worth studying, and a rare few as the embodiment of something the Imperium lost long ago. Even the Space Marines, who normally view unorthodox faith with cold dismissal, have reportedly intervened not to kill her, but to clear her path. There's a tale, unconfirmed but persistent, of a squad of Black Templars who encountered her on the war-torn ruins of Praxis 13. They didn't speak, they didn't salute, but they stood aside. What does that tell us? It tells us that Stern has become a mirror, not just to the Imperium, but to everyone. She reflects the questions we're not supposed to ask. What is faith without doctrine? What is purity without approval? What is the Emperor's will if it can manifest in someone who defies his church? She doesn't fit the iconography. No golden halo, no flowing robes, just scars, ash, and a gaze that looks like it's already seen the end of the galaxy and decided to keep walking anyway. And somehow that makes her feel more sacred than any shrine could ever capture. To me, Ephrael Stern is the closest thing Warhammer has to a true martyr, not because she died for a cause, but because she keeps living without one. She walks, not because she has answers, but because she refuses to accept the ones she's been given. That refusal, that defiance without hatred, that persistence without command, that's what makes her holy. So call her heretic, call her saint, call her anomaly. She'll answer to none of it, but she will keep walking, and will keep watching. The Imperium doesn't fear Ephrael Stern simply because she's powerful. It fears her because she undermines the very logic on which the Imperium survives. She isn't just a threat to safety, to security, to military operations, or ecclesiarchal dominance. She is a direct contradiction to the illusion of unity, and that illusion is what the Imperium has spent 10,000 years protecting. More than borders, more than relics, more than lives. Because Stern, in her quiet, relentless defiance, doesn't preach heresy. She embodies the possibility that truth exists outside of the Codex, that miracles don't need sanction, that the Emperor's will might operate in ways even the High Lords can't comprehend. And if that's possible, then how much else is a lie? That's the real terror. Not that Stern will lead an army. Not that she'll tear down the ecclesiarchy with warp-fueled rage, but that she might convince people, without saying a word, that the Imperium's interpretation of the divine is wrong. Or worse, unnecessary. The Adeptus Ministorum, for all its pageantry, exists to protect a single idea, that order equals faith and faith equals control. It's a closed loop. Everything about it is designed to keep humanity spiritually obedient. The sermons, the shrines, the relics, the bloody martyrdoms. Not because they deepen belief, but because they define it. You believe what you're told, you kneel when commanded, and you love the Emperor in the exact shape you're allowed to. But Stern? She shattered that shape. She never denounced the Emperor, never embraced chaos. She just started believing in him without the filter of the church. That's what makes her dangerous. She still believes. In something older, maybe purer. A form of faith that doesn't rely on ritual or hierarchy. And if she can do that, why can't others? You see the problem. The Imperium doesn't fear apostasy. It knows how to handle traitors. Heresy can be burned, isolated, purged. But doubt? That's a plague with no cure. And Stern's very existence spreads it like wildfire. She's not telling people to disobey. She's just reminding them, by living, by surviving, by walking, that faith isn't something the ecclesiarchy owns. And that's the point. Stern represents an ideological fracture, a split not between good and evil, but between obedience and understanding. She forces a question that no preacher, no cardinal, no inquisitor once asked. What if the Emperor never wanted this? What if the wars, the purges, the entire machinery of faith was our doing? There are whispers that some lower-ranked preachers have gone silent after hearing her name. That certain Ministorum adepts have quietly retracted firebrand sermons when they realized their audience began asking, what would Stern do? Instead of, what does the ecclesiarchy command? It doesn't take a rebellion, just curiosity. Just the notion that belief can exist without brutality. One fan theory I've always found compelling suggests that Stern isn't a relic of the past or a weapon of the future, but a preview, a mutation of faith, that she's what happens when belief outgrows the system that once protected it. Not a schism, not a revolution, but an evolution. And that, more than daemons or aliens or warp storms, is what shakes the foundations of the Imperium. Because imagine this. What if faith becomes personal? Not standardized, not regulated. Not preached from golden altars. Just quiet, raw, terrifying conviction. In a galaxy held together by dogma, by bureaucracy, by the endless need for control, Stern is entropy, not through chaos, through freedom. And that's far harder to fight. The ecclesiarchy can't canonize her because to do so would be to admit that faith can arise outside of their authority. The Inquisition can't justify her execution with proof of corruption because there is none. Even the Space Marines, the most pragmatic of all forces, have little consensus. Some view her as a risk. Others, as a symbol of a truth they've always suspected, that the Emperor was never a god but became one through belief. And Stern might be proof that divinity is just belief powerful enough to shape reality. In that sense, she's more than an anomaly. She's a reflection of the Imperium's greatest lie, that unity must come at the cost of understanding. And now that she exists, now that people know she exists, that lie begins to fracture. There are reports, buried in inquisitorial codices, of small planetary rebellions sparked not by chaos or Xenos contact, but by visions. Dreams of a woman walking through fire without burning, a sister of battle wrapped in silence, followed by shadows. Villages where the name Stern became synonymous with liberation, not through violence, through the realization that faith can mean something else. And the Imperium's response? Always the same. Bombard. Silence. Erase. Because you can't reason with a symbol, you can only destroy it or be changed by it. That's the impasse. Ephrael Stern can't be caught, not just because she moves like a ghost through the stars, but because she no longer needs to be present. Her name is enough. Her story is enough. The idea of her, broken, hunted, unbowed, is enough to make someone light a candle in the dark and believe in something unsanctioned. And that is why she terrifies the Imperium more than any demon prince. Because she's not chaos. She's choice. The longer Ephrael Stern walks the galaxy, the less she resembles a person, and the more she becomes something else entirely. A myth still breathing, bleeding, and somehow refusing to end. And that's what's so disturbing about her continued presence in the wars of the 41st millennium. It's not that she survives, it's how she survives. As if time, like death, simply can't quite catch her. Her name appears in the margins of a dozen conflicts, sometimes redacted, sometimes rewritten, always distorted. She never arrives with banners, never leads armies, but in the places where the lines between reality and nightmare begin to blur, where demons pour through the cracks and the imperial creed begins to crumble, she's there. Just for a moment, just enough to turn the tide, and then she's gone. One of the clearest sightings was during the Karnak uprising. Officially, it was a chaos cult infiltration that triggered a demonic eruption in the lower hive sectors. Unofficially, multiple survivors, including an injured sister Dialogus, reported seeing a figure in broken sororitas armor walking calmly through the smoke. No insignia, no order markings, just a silent presence that passed untouched through warpfire and madness. They say she stood in the heart of the chaos, reached out a hand, and the demon prince leading the cult froze, didn't die, didn't scream, just stopped. And then unraveled. There was no report, no explanation. The site was declared purged, the survivors reassigned, their memories sealed or dismissed, but the whispers remained. She walks through daemons like they're paper. Another incident took place on Varela Prime during the Necron Awakening. The Mechanicus had lost contact with a deep tomb exploration team, and the Skitarii were being overwhelmed. That's not where you'd expect to find Ephrael Stern. And yet, records from a damaged servitor drone captured a frame, a lone humanoid shape bathed in flickering energy, walking toward a cryptek as it raised its staff to fire. The machine never fired. It just collapsed in silence. No damage, no explosion, just ceased to function. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared the footage corrupted, but not before it spread. This is how Stern exists now, not in war zones but around them. Not as a warrior, but as a myth that appears when reality starts to bend. A kind of spiritual fault line. She doesn't save people, she doesn't liberate planets, she just is. And her presence alone seems to throw things off balance. Some say she's fighting for the Imperium in her own way, that she appears where the threat is greatest, where the veil is thinnest. Others argue she's a force of correction, not allegiance, that she appears not to protect the Imperium, but to prevent it, and chaos, from winning. Like she's part of a deeper equation neither side understands. There's a particularly eerie story from the Black Crusade of Archon Malov. A Death Guard warband had occupied an entire Forge world, turning its machinery into plague engines. The Astra Militarum couldn't break through. The Adeptus Sororitas lost 2 entire orders in the first week, and then silence. Vox communication cut out. Orbital pict feeds showed nothing for days. When contact was re-established, the planet was empty. Not just of the Death Guard, of everything. Every body, every weapon, every trace of life or death gone. All that was left was a single word etched into the adamantium surface of a cathedral wall. Witness. One Magos claimed to have decoded a deeper psychic echo in the area, a pulse like a heartbeat that didn't come from any known species. And though it was dismissed as Warshock hallucination, he swore he saw a figure in the static. A woman, alone, walking into the mist. That's the terrifying part. Not that Stern kills, but that she unravels. Places warp-touched begin to fray in her presence. Time stutters, things vanish, and yet she walks away untouched, silent, often unseen. Like a ghost cleaning up after a cosmic breakdown. It's no wonder some now worship her, not as a saint, but as an inevitability, a living force of rejection. She doesn't belong to any doctrine, doesn't preach, doesn't threaten, but she represents something the Imperium has no counter to. The possibility that reality itself is tired of the way things are, and she might be its answer. And the more the Imperium tries to kill her, the stronger the myth becomes. Entire shrine worlds have banned mention of her name, yet pilgrims carve it into stone, in secret. She lives. Therefore, we believe. It's not rebellion, it's longing. For something more human than the mechanical rituals of survival that dominate the Imperium's theology. And still she keeps showing up. No pattern, no explanation. Some theorists believe she's being guided. Not by the warp, not by the Emperor, but by something else. An intelligence operating behind the scenes of history. One fan suggested she's a shard of a forgotten truth, something the galaxy once knew before chaos rose, before the Emperor ascended. Something older than gods or tyrants. Others think she's not alive anymore at all. That the real Stern died at Sanctalis, and what walks now is a remnant, a will that refused to fade. A soul burning so brightly, it caught the attention of the stars themselves. Whatever the truth is, it no longer matters in a conventional sense. Because at this point, Ephrael Stern doesn't need to survive physically to exist. Her myth is a presence now, a shape moving through war, through memory, through doubt. You can't kill a myth that people need to believe in. And Ephrael Stern has become exactly that, a living contradiction, too dangerous to canonize, too sacred to ignore. A force walking through a galaxy that's forgotten how to hope, reminding it, wordlessly, that hope doesn't need permission, just persistence. There's something profoundly terrifying to the Imperium about things it cannot define. In a galaxy built on labels, heretic, loyalist, mutant, martyr, Ephrael Stern is a void in the system. She doesn't fit any category, doesn't obey any doctrine, doesn't follow any path that's been laid out for her. And that's exactly why the Imperium fears her. Because control is the Imperium's last illusion. And Stern proves it's just that, an illusion. She's not a daemon, she's not a witch, she's not even a revolutionary. She's just there, still walking, still breathing, still believing, but not in the way she's supposed to. She is proof that something can be both devout and defiant, that someone can still love the Emperor and reject the mechanisms built in his name. That truth, stripped of its banners and blood-stained icons, can survive and even thrive in silence. And maybe that's the deepest threat of all. Because Stern reminds us that even in the deepest night, light can appear. Not because someone lit a torch, but because someone refused to be extinguished. The Imperium's fear is not that she'll lead a rebellion, it's that she already has. One without speeches or banners, without armies or fortresses. A rebellion of thought. A rebellion of faith. Quiet, slow, infectious. She is a question that cannot be silenced. A presence that cannot be explained. A flame that burns in the cracks of a cold iron regime. And no matter how many kill orders they stamp, how many excommunications they scream into the void, she continues to walk. Some believe that one day she will die. That someone, somewhere, will finally end her story. But even if that day comes, what she's become will live on. Not as a relic, not as a saint, as a symbol that even in the age of darkness, something pure, something new can still be born. Something outside the cages of faith and fear. I've seen fan art of her standing alone on a broken battlefield, a single candle glowing in her hand while the sky burns around her. No halo, no wings, just her, tired, scarred, but still walking. And I think that image says everything. Because the galaxy doesn't need more icons. It needs reminders. Reminders that faith can exist without cruelty. That survival isn't always submission. That maybe, just maybe, the Emperor isn't a god who demands blood, but a spark that waits to be kindled in a soul brave enough to ask why. That's what Ephrael Stern is. A spark. And sparks are hard to catch, impossible to cage. But if they fall in the right place, they burn. They ignite. So yes, the Imperium fears her, not because of what she can do, but because of what she proves. That obedience isn't the same as faith, that survival isn't the same as purpose, that even after all these millennia, something unexpected can still emerge from the cracks. And maybe somewhere deep inside the halls of Terra, in some forgotten chamber of the Imperial Palace, someone ancient and silent still watches her path. Not with fear, not with anger, but with regret or hope. Or something in between. And if that's true, then maybe she's not walking away from the Imperium. Maybe she's walking toward the version of it that could have been. If you've made it this far, you probably already feel it. The gravity of her story, the impossible tension of someone who stands against everything without lifting a single banner. Ephrael Stern doesn't ask for belief. She doesn't need to. Her presence is enough. Her refusal to die is enough. Her silence is loud enough to echo through the entire Imperium. So if you want more of these stories, the ones that peel back the dogma and reveal something raw beneath, the myths that live and breathe in the shadows of the galaxy, then subscribe. Because this universe isn't just about bolters and blood. It's about the moments in between, the ones they try to bury. And sometimes, like Stern, those moments refuse to stay buried. They walk, and we follow.